Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator at Gibson's Bookstore, and I am very pleased to welcome back to Gibson's Remote. We've had her three times in the store, Virginia Macgregor, who is a dear friend of the store, and she is here tonight for the launch event of her new book, You Found Me, which is her new novel. I believe this is the US launch. It has been out in the UK, and this is its first time on the US soil. She is joined in conversation by her friend, author Jennifer Steil, whose book is Exile Music, her latest book. Both of these books are available from Gibson's Bookstore. Virginia's are signed. Jennifer's come with a lovely book plate, which is also signed.
Sent all the way from France.
All the way from France. So they are here from French soil to American soil here in New Hampshire. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us tonight. How are you?
Well, I'm very well. The kids are in bed. The house is quiet. Poor Jennifer is up at, 12:30?
1:30.
1:30 at night. Oh. So a real act of love to be here tonight.
Yes, well, I'm delighted to be here. I cannot tell you how happy I am to be here. I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you about your new book. And Virginia and I have kind of switched continents. But we both met. Can I tell this? Can I tell? Okay, well, I can start. You could tell the story. But so I met Virginia. We met years ago. It was early 2000. 2000.
About 10 years ago.
10?
Yeah,
I think it was 2010, 2011. I was in a hospital waiting room, waiting for a very boring appointment and reading. And someone leaned over and said, what are you reading? What do you think of that book?
I can see that.
And I think Virginia might be the only stranger who actually spoke to me in all the years I lived in London. And she was there with her mother. And we started talking. And yeah, Virginia, do you want to?
Well, I think it's just extraordinary how these connections are made. So Jennifer was this gorgeous, curly-haired, charismatic individual sitting there with her yoga mat. And I think a book by Anne Patchett is what I think she was reading at the time. And I didn't know Anne Patchett at the time. And she just looked so interesting. And I was there for the day. I'd taken the day off teaching. My mother had back issues. Jennifer has back issues. And there's this extraordinary back specialist in a London hospital. And so I got talking to Jennifer. And then through the years, really, we came to find that you lived in a part of the world that I loved, which was New England, that you went to school, so high school in Vermont in a boarding school. And I was really interested in moving here and working in a boarding school. And then I met my husband, and so was he. And so I've ended up living in America, right next door to where Jennifer used to live. And I gather you came to the theater in Concord when you were a little girl with your parents, right?
Yeah, well, because we grew up kind of between Massachusetts and Vermont, and we spent a fair amount of time in New Hampshire, living close to the border. And I actually taught at St. Paul's School. I taught Shakespeare for a summer. So there's definitely a history in the area. So.
And actually the whole meeting thing ties up so well, I think, with the book, because I'm someone, if you know me, who loves to go up to strangers and ask questions. And some of the best friends I have in the world are people that I've met in that way on a bus, in the waiting room of a doctor's surgery. And I think I channeled that a little bit through the little girl River in this book, who just walks up to a complete stranger. And we don't do that very much. I think maybe I got that from my mother. She's very sociable, but we have, so much fear around strangers. But actually some of the most wonderful human beings I've ever met are people who I just had the courage to go up to, or who seemed intriguing. And so that ties in with the book too.
Yes. And so, Virginia, would you mind introducing You Found Me? Just telling us a little bit about the story, what it's about briefly. And do you feel up to reading a little snippet so we can get a flavor of your voice?
I'd love to.
I'd love to hear some of it in your voice. It would be...
So often people in America who obviously know my voice is quite different from the people around them, they say when they read my books, they hear my voice in their head, which I think is very sweet, because obviously it stands out here. So You Found Me is my fourth book for adults. I've written 2 young adult books. And the story begins with a little girl called River. She's 11 with her mother walking through a park in London. And the little girl's very curious and open-hearted, and she sees this man sitting on a bench, and I'll read that section to you in a minute. And he is in the rain, and he is soaked to the bone, and he looks miserable. And she runs up to him and tries to work out what's wrong with him. And you know, in that wonderful way that children have, just completely unfiltered, just wants to find out what's wrong. Why is he crying? Why is he in the rain? Why is he, you know, there's a building that's just burnt down at the bottom of our street, and Tennessee keeps asking me to slow down to look. And she says, Mum, you know, kids are really interested in this stuff, you know, and I'm like, we have to get to school. And I think children just are insatiably curious. And so the book starts with finding this man, and it turns out that he doesn't remember who he is or where he's from or what his name is. And the mother and the daughter go on this big adventure through the course of this summer, this very English summer in London, working out who he is and helping him. And through that, you know, they come to find out about each other and themselves, and where this man came from and why he's so lost. So that's essentially the premise of it. And shall I read a bit from it now?
Yeah, yes. Why don't you give us a little taste of it, and then maybe afterwards we'll talk about your inspiration for the story. But I'd love to share, you know, to have people hear a bit of it in your voice.
Wonderful, thank you. And also we're going to hear a bit of Jennifer's book too, so you'll get those two different flavors. So this is where I thought the best would be to give you exactly that point in the book where everything kicks off, where River first finds this man. And like I said, she's walking through the park in the rain. She's on her way to her last day of school before the summer holidays. There's a man sitting on a bench just by the entrance to the zoo. He's all by himself, and his head is in his hands. Everything about him is wet. His tangled brown hair is smushed down in his face, and his jacket's dripping from the seams. His tie's soggy, his white shirt's gone see-through, his trousers are sticking to his legs, and his feet are sitting in a puddle. It's like he's gone for a swim with all his clothes on. At first, River can't work out whether the drops plopping from the man's eyes are rain or tears, but from the gulping sound he was making a moment ago, he's obviously been crying. River can't remember the last time she saw a man cry, a proper grown-up one. She goes over, sits beside him, and tilts her umbrella to shield him. Are you okay? She asks. He looks up at River and blinks. More tears drop out of his eyes. Although he looks beaten down by the rain, he's not old. He must be about Mum's age, which makes it weird that he's sitting here. People Mum's age usually have jobs they're rushing to in the morning. What's your name? River asks. River, come back here. Mum's voice carries over to them from up the road. The man looks at River, startled. Don't worry, it's just Mum. River studies the man. What's your name then? She asks again. He looks down into his hands like he's trying to find his name written in his palms. River spots an inky smudge on his left forefinger. Maybe he's left-handed like her. Maybe he holds his pen too low as well. Are you waiting for the zoo to open? She asks. He looks over to the entrance but doesn't answer. The man smells damp and musty, like River's clothes do when Mum forgets to take them out of the washing machine. He could be a homeless person, River thinks, but homeless people don't wear suits, do they? Then River notices a stick propped up beside him against the bench. She wonders whether there's something wrong with his legs and whether that's why he's been sitting in the rain getting soaked, because he can't move. River, you're going to be late for school. A moment later, Mum's standing in front of them. She stares at the man, and River can tell that she's taking it all in. His blotchy, tear-stained face and his soggy clothes and his squelchy feet. River stands up and pulls Mum to one side. I think he's sad, she whispers. Mum takes River's hand and says, he probably just needs some time to himself. Come on, River, let's not bother him any longer. Mum gives River's hand a yank. River pulls her hand away. He's soaking. We can't just leave him. Mum goes over to the man. I'm sorry we disturbed you, she tells him. River likes to talk to people. Mum doesn't mean people, she means strangers. She's told River off for doing it before. It's another thing that keeps Mum up at night, River talking to strangers and her fear that she'll be stolen away from her. Only most of the strangers River's met seem really nice, nicer sometimes than the non-strangers in her life. My name's River. River holds out her hand. River waits for him to tell her his name back, but he doesn't say anything. So she leans towards him and tries not to let the damp smell into her nose and says, I hope you feel better soon. The sky goes from dark grey to lighter grey, and suddenly the rain stops. River looks up. Phew! She puts down her umbrella and gives it a shake. Then she grins at him. There might be a rainbow. Very slowly, the corner of the man's mouth turns up, and for a second, he doesn't look quite so sad anymore. Do you like rainbows? She asks. He nods. So do I. They're probably my favourite thing in the whole world. The man's smile goes a little wider. I think we've bothered this gentleman long enough, Mum says. Let's get going, River. But River doesn't want to go until she knows who he is. Don't you have a name? She asks. River likes to find out about people's names, especially unusual ones that come from faraway countries that she's never been to, names that roll around in her mouth and take a while to learn to say properly. If we know your name, then we can be friends, River says. Then River wonders whether it would be possible to be someone's friend without ever knowing their name. Mum tugs at River's arm and pulls her away. River tries to think of a reason to persuade Mum to stay a little longer, and then she hears a quiet voice behind her. I don't remember. River spins round. His voice sounds different from the way English people speak. It kind of rolls. You don't remember what? River asks. The man looks right into River's eyes. I don't remember. He coughs and takes a while to get his breath back. Then he looks back up at River with his big, sad brown eyes and says, I don't remember my name. So that is the beginning of the story.
That's such a beautiful section. That's such a vivid scene. I can see him. I can see his transparent shirt. I can feel the rain, and you know, those questions that River asks are so recognizable to me as a child's questions.
Yeah.
And that kind of interest they take in people that's not polluted by all of our grown-up fears.
Yeah.
So that, can I just read one sentence from your book that I?
Yes, please do.
So there's just, when I first started reading it, I think I might have said this in an email to you, but I just love this one bit where it says, this is before River meets him, and you write, he stopped minding the rain a long time ago. It is part of him now, of his hair and beard and clothes. Soon it will seep through his skin and start running through his veins like a river, like the sea. And I love that. I love the image of the rain seeping through the skin and running through him, becoming part of him. And then of course you also have the word river in there,
yeah,
which feels purposeful.
And also I love the rain. You know, I
Yeah.
wrote this book when I was feeling quite homesick for England. I just arrived in America, and there's not as much rain here. It comes occasionally, but it's not as persistent.
Right.
And I think I missed the rain. It's funny, isn't it, how you channel things like that? So
Yeah, we're fellow rain lovers. I think rain, you know, rainy days make you feel very like it's okay to stay inside and read.
right.
And
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
like
Right.
or go out and dance in the rain, which is
Yes.
how my daughter deals with it. But it's, I think it's a cozy. I love rain myself, so I get that totally. Virginia, I know that this was inspired by well, why don't you tell us what inspired you to write this book originally? And
so often I'm inspired by something that I notice in contemporary life, or a news article that just has lots of question marks for me. And I think it was 2005. And so obviously I stored this away for quite a while. I read a newspaper article about a German man called Andreas Glassel, who was found walking around London, around Kent actually, in England. And a very similar story, who was wearing, you know, a tie and a suit, but really quite disheveled. And he seemed to have just forgotten any sense of who he was. He didn't understand where he was, and he was taken to a hospital, and he was given a piece of paper, and he drew a grand piano. And that's all he drew. He was asked to write his name, but he never wrote his name. He just drew a picture of a piano. And then they had the foresight to bring him a piano. And he started playing these extraordinary tunes, you know, everything from Tchaikovsky to the Beatles, to, and gradually they unpicked who he was and where he was from. And there was this big question mark over him, because he was clearly foreign. You know, was he an immigrant? Was he an illegal immigrant? Was he forgetting on purpose? Was it a hoax? Was he, you know, the nature of memory? What had he forgotten? Had he experienced some sort of trauma? And all those questions I thought were so rife for a novelist. And so I immediately, when I read about him, I had this picture, and I often know that I've got a novel in my head when I get this picture of an opening scene of a mother and a daughter walking through a park and spotting a man like this sitting in the rain, and then just because it's a metaphor for everybody, really. Who are you? Where are you from? You know, what do you remember? What trauma have you experienced? How does that form part of who you are today? And that was just a wonderful vehicle for me to explore that. And then through that came issues of censorship and immigration, and which weren't linked to the original character, Andreas Glassel, but which then I attached to my new character.
That's interesting. I mean, because it's, you know, I think when you write about, you know, him being in the rain and being wet and washed up there somehow, you know, it does kind of remind you of all the other refugees who have literally washed up on the shores of other countries, or who have drowned in various boats trying to escape repressive regimes and ended up in places completely and utterly unfamiliar to them. And I wonder, so you mentioned that your original inspiration wasn't, it didn't have the same immigration refugee issue. So how did that come into it?
Just, I suppose when I write contemporary fiction, I love to create a snapshot. And I think, you know, we discussed this at one point, you know, that, you know, there are lots of issues packed into the book. And I've had that comment before from other people about books I've written. And I just, I say this, you know, planning to write a historical book down the line, but I think what I love about contemporary fiction is I try to just create a slice of what life is like now, and what the political issues are, and what the issues are facing people and families and women. And, you know, if you were to try and create a snapshot of America right now, there's just so much going on, and yet it's very real, you know, that we're struggling with things as mothers, as fathers, as workers. And I think when I was writing that book, and I imagined this character, and Andreas Glassel, the inspiration for it, he wasn't an immigrant in the sense that he went back to live in England, but he was foreign. He was a foreigner. Mm-hmm. And there were questions about whether he was an illegal immigrant, because maybe that was why he was trying to pretend that he didn't know who he was so that he could stay. And so that triggered the idea for the immigration. But also at the time, I was opening the paper every day and reading these stories, as you said, of people risking their whole lives to start, you know, their new life somewhere new. And also all those stories seem to be about Syria or about, you know, far-flung places. And I think people weren't as aware of the immigration happening perhaps within Europe and on our doorstep. And so I wanted to explore that aspect through him.
Right, which brings me to well, am I allowed to mention the country, or should you want me to keep that a secret?
You can mention it. I feel like when people come back to read it, you know, they won't remember every detail of, you know,
yeah. So how did you come to settle on the particular, I actually don't have to mention, I say, how could you come to settle on the particular country that you chose for him to be from?
Oh, that's fun. Then our listeners can guess. So I think it was something that had been, I must have read about it or talked to someone about it and been really shocked. So the country in question is in Europe. And it is still run as a dictatorship, essentially. And the dictator in question is regarded as, you know, the last European or true European dictator, or even self-proclaimed dictator. And the regime there is really brutal. There's a great deal of censorship, particularly of the arts. And, you know, human rights issues are, you know, constantly violated. And, you know, I've heard him say things like, you know, when he's been accused of being homophobic, he said things like, oh, I'd rather be a dictator than be gay. Or, you know, when he was accused of being a dictator, he said, I'd rather be a dictator than be gay. You know, things like that, just completely, you know, unashamedly, you know, in violation of anything pertaining to human rights. And this was just on our doorstep. This was, you know, on the European continent. And somehow it wasn't filling the newspapers or being talked about as much as I felt, you know, we were talking about the Middle East. And so I just wanted to raise that as an issue, and also give a sense of people fleeing from that country and coming to places like England or London, where things seemed much more open, particularly if you have an artistic temperament. And my main character, he is an artist. So I haven't made him a musician like Andreas Glassel. He's an artist, and he draws for a living. He's a political cartoonist. And so he gets into a lot of trouble for drawing these political cartoons in his home country, and therefore has to flee for his life.
Which is also resonant of a lot of other news stories that we've read about cartoons in particular. And I mean, freedom of expression is not something that we can ever take for granted, because it seems like no matter what part of the world we are, there's always someone trying to take away the right to free expression, free artistic expression, free political expression. all manner of free expression, I think France has had recent struggles in the news. So that's very timely. And interesting. And I loved kind of slowly discovering, because you start with the section you read, you start with that ink smudge on his finger, and that ink smudge which slowly blossoms into his history.
And it's something, and that's linked to the amnesia as well. So when I talked to neurologists, and this is what they found out about the man who played the piano so brilliantly, is that when the part of your brain is damaged that is to do with remembering and memory, the artistic ability, whether it be musical or fine art, whatever, it often remains. And sometimes it's the only thing that remains. And I thought that was such a fascinating thing, that you can have forgotten your name, but you can play to the level of being a concert pianist. And that said something to me about the importance of the arts and how deep art goes within our human soul and how much we need it to understand ourselves and to survive. And I'd like to segue. Okay. This is the wonderful way in which my book connects to Jennifer's. So Jennifer's book, Exile Music, is also about immigration, but takes place in the Second World War. And it has music in the title. And the parents of the little girl in question, who's the main character, who's the main voice in the book, they are both musicians. And just extraordinary how through the trauma that they experience on their journey of fleeing Nazi Austria and then going all the way to live in Bolivia, how differently the parents respond, and the use or the putting aside of their art and their music, and how the little girl responds too. And so I think Jennifer and I didn't really know before we'd read each other's respective books, and that they're different time periods and different styles and so on, but they both explore how art, maybe you can tell us a bit about, your motivation for exploring that.
Right. So yes, so this family of musicians, the father's a viola player and the mother is an opera singer, when they flee Austria, and the little girl who's the main character who grows up over the course of the book, they end up in Bolivia in the middle of the Andes. So the mother, because she's left her son behind and the rest of her family, she finds herself unable to sing, because for her, singing comes from a place of joy. And so she loses music, she loses her connection with music, and she becomes the most unmoored of the family, the most unable to go on, the one who sinks into depression that almost consumes her. Whereas the father, who's always had music in his life, clings to his viola playing as a way to sustain himself and his relationship with his students. And he ends up using music as a way to adapt to his new environment, by learning the local music, the Bolivian music, and learning from his students, and discovering a freedom, an artistic freedom that he didn't have as part of the Vienna Philharmonic, when he was playing a certain repertoire. Suddenly he's able to explore things he couldn't do before. And Orly, of course, she's young, she's 10 when she arrives. And so she, eventually takes up a Bolivian instrument and learns how to play a Bolivian instrument. And so for her, and she also gets involved with poetry and with theater, with other art forms that in various ways help her and other refugees to find their way forward. So that is definitely a connection between our books, in that art is kind of the only thing left to this. I mean, in your story, that it's the only thing left to this man, and I won't get into his specifics of his loss, but that's what he has left, is that. And for my characters as well, music and poetry and theater, that's all they have left, having come from Austria with nothing and ended up in the middle of nowhere.
And in some ways, another connection, I mean, in my book, River the Little Girl, she bonds over the drawing with the man. She calls him Reg, because he's from Regent's Park, and Reg is actually a name in England, for Reginald, but because he won't, he doesn't know his name. And they draw together, and she's someone who struggles at school. She struggles with conventional learning, with reading, and she finds she can draw, and she can draw with him, and she learns, and she perfects her drawing and tries to impress him by practicing. And there's that wonderful bond. And I feel that's the same with you, that somehow art transcends culture in that way, or it transcends culture, but also it allows you to get into a culture, and bond in a way that perhaps language might be a barrier, but something like music or art can kind of go past that.
Right, because both music and visual arts are things that
Yes.
don't require language to
Yeah.
transmit.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is one other way that our characters are similar. Um, can I ask you, just because I'm curious about
Yes.
this? I have so many questions, but I'm so excited to be talking to you about all these, because I was reading and thinking, oh, there's another thing we can talk about.
Thank
We're
you.
not going to have nearly enough time.
Time, yeah.
So you've talked a bit about the amnesia, and what was it that made you decide that that made you think that this character, how did I word it when I wrote it down? Why was it important to your story that he not be able to remember what happened?
I guess it has lots of different layers. I've always been really interested by memory as a concept. And I remember when I was an English teacher talking to my students, and we discussed how memory in itself is almost a fiction, because it's impossible really for anyone to remember anything with complete accuracy, because we remember it within the context of our own stories and our own characters, and through the years memory shifts and changes. And so the nature of memory being subjective anyway has always interested me as a writer, an artist, and a reader. And then the notion of how memory is very much tied to our psychology, I thought was particularly interesting. And I looked for this man that Reg in my book, I looked into how trauma affects memory and the inability to recall things and to remember things, and how somehow that's the brain's way of protecting itself when it experiences great trauma, that sometimes it just shuts down and stops remembering. And every case, when the brain is damaged physically through brain trauma, it's very clear to see which parts of the brain have been damaged, and therefore link it to what is, the person is able to do or not do, or remember or not remember. But when it has a psychological basis, it's very much case by case as to when the memory comes back and when it doesn't come back. And that also creates, I think, an interesting plot vehicle from a craft point of view as a writer, because we're wanting to find out who he is and where he's from, and that sort of propels the narrative. So I think the theme of it and the psychology of it fascinates me, but also, it was a very useful device, and it is a metaphor for all of us really getting to know ourselves and others. How much of ourselves do we really truly know and understand? How much are we creatures who are in constant process of becoming? How much of our past forms part of who we are today? How much of it can we shed? And then how much do we ever know another person fully? So those themes came in too.
And also kind of how much we might still be driven by things we can't remember.
Oh.
That's really interesting, because he's clearly still propelled by things that he can't remember. And that is also another interesting concept that you get into. And it works so well as a narrative device, of course, because I desperately wanted to know who he was. And of course, to make your plot work, you had to have that. But, I was curious kind of as to how you get started, and you've
and that what you said about how do the things we don't remember affect us, I find fascinating, because I don't have a very good memory. I have friends, one friend in particular, I'm helping her write her story. She has like the recall she has for particular days and exactly what happened and who was there and what time of day it was, and stretching back. And some people have such vivid memories of so many parts of their childhood. And I'm not one of those people. And so I often wonder how much of what I don't remember forms who I am today. Right. That's a really interesting point.
That's interesting, because I find that sometimes, there are times where a traumatic event, like the weather on that day, and, that's why everyone remembers the weather on September 11th, for example, 2001, because the traumatic event made us remember everything about that day. And so sometimes trauma makes us, it kind of crystallizes our memory and cements it in a way. I find, like, days that a day I was in an automobile accident, like I remember every detail of that, but I couldn't tell you anything about
you had for breakfast 3 days ago. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like I have no idea, so yeah, there's it's fascinating. Memory is such an
interesting thing. Yeah.
So all right, this is kind of a big question, but kind of central to your story is you make it clear how the stifling of your central character, Reg, and I know Regent's Park well, so I was pleased that he after Regent's Park. So you make it clear how the stifling of his freedom of expression affects not only him and his own livelihood, but it affects his family. which I won't get into the specifics of that. I want to let the readers discover that on their own. But I was wondering if it's possible for you, without any spoilers, to talk about this kind of, I don't know, maybe a ripple effect of suppression, and what new understanding of human rights you're hoping that readers will come away with, after reading this story.
I think we've talked about how important the arts are in every culture for us as human beings, how they anchor us, they help us understand ourselves and navigate the world and deal with trauma and all the rest of it. And it's interesting that the minute an oppressive regime comes into play, one of the first things they go after are the arts, I think, and try and kind of shut down freedom of expression and artistic expression, because they see that as very threatening, because it's not something they can have a handle over. And so, I think that's an interesting aspect, a kind of different angle to it that I found really interesting when writing, particularly the case of this character, was as artists, we're always torn, I think, between our family life and our creative life, that our creative life is like looking after a child. And yet we have a real child who needs us as well. And because the kind of commitment and devotion to a profession, an artistic profession, I think is so all-encompassing. When you're writing a book, or when you're composing, or when you're playing music at a high level, and I guess sports can maybe be the same, but when you live your life in such a devoted way, and in this case, the moral dilemma from the main character is that he has a wife and a little girl, and he lives in an oppressive regime, and creating these political cartoons are part of who he is. They're his lifeblood, they're an essential part of his identity, and he also sees it as a really, really, really important thing to do for his society. And yet he knows that every time one of those cartoons gets published or comes into the public domain, he is endangering not only his life, but the life of his child and of his wife. And so, as always in fiction, it's a kind of heightened form of the more general point, which is, how much as an artist do you sacrifice your family to your art? And in this case, it was to the extent that, their lives were in danger. And so that was a theme that I thought was interesting to explore.
Yeah, we're fortunate in that we're able to write kind of mostly what we want to write in our books, and not have to deal with that. But there was, in one of my previous books, I had one brief section where, my husband, who never never tells me, like, never says, don't write this or write this. He's like, write whatever you want, no censorship. But he said, you could keep this one paragraph in here, but if you do, people will probably come after us. In the country we were living in. And so I took it out because it wasn't so important that I was willing to put my husband and daughter at risk. But at the same time, had it felt important to the book, I would have chosen my family. But I could see how that's difficult, if you have a really important political message and you are being really stifled. How can you speak out and not endanger the people you love is. And another thing that, this is slightly different, but you made me think of it when you were talking about the arts, is that it's interesting that, in some ways, many cultures are consider arts to be frivolous or not essential to our educations, right? But arts must have power or they wouldn't try to stifle them.
Yeah.
So in trying to stifle his comics, other people's writing, what you're saying is writing is powerful, literature is powerful. Art is powerful. Otherwise, why would you try to control it?
Well, it was like, I can't remember the details, but for my last birthday, Hugh took me to see Hamilton in Boston. I hadn't seen it before. And I think it was around that time, there was a whole hoo-ha, wasn't there, about, pence and Trump.
Oh, right.
And I just thought, wow, if they're getting worked up about Hamilton, right? That's saying something. And it's that thing that people feel threatened by artists, by actors, by plays, because they don't feel it's something they can control. And the messages they feel they can't control. So yeah, it is fascinating how it creeps into even, so-called democratic countries.
Right. So there's a recognition there that arts could sway these people.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. Okay, let's see, which do I want to ask first? Okay, do you want to talk just a little bit about the various kinds of research you did? River, the little girl, has ADHD. I'm not giving anything away, that you find that out very early in the book. But so you must have done some research into that. And then there's You must have done some medical research. So do you want to talk a little bit about the research you did?
Yeah, so the research for me is quite organic. I know some people like to do all their research beforehand and then sit down to write, but I kind of feel like the research issues come up as I write and I get to know the characters particularly. I mean, some of them were very obvious. So my main character, I needed to understand where he was from and what his issues were. But with the ADHD, it was, I had a view of this little girl who was very energetic and very curious, and you probably get a sense from her voice in the passage that I read to you that she's constantly asking questions. She has this excess of energy. And she just finds it really hard to go to school in a very conventional way and to sit still behind a desk and to be told to learn in a particular way. And I was a teacher, so I've met those kinds of children. And I find that often in books that I read, children are presented, because that's what we were like as authors, is very kind of bookish and intellectual and good at school. And I don't always see represented, those children who struggle. And I just wanted to have a character who had a different intelligence and a different way of knowing and a different way of understanding the world. And then the relief she feels when she feels she can communicate through art and find her passion through, her relationship with this man, this stranger, becomes so important. And he actually helps her fall back in love with school, because he shows her how school can benefit her, and how it can help her, and how there might be teachers who do understand. And so to research her, to answer your question, I actually just I had my knowledge as a teacher of understanding students who worked in that way, but I actually asked lots of people around me as adults about what their experiences were like as children, adults who were very. And interestingly, quite a few adults who came to reading late in life because they felt that their ADHD at school, precluded them from falling in love with reading. And they were really helpful in that. And then other things, I talked to a neuroscientist about, to neurologist about the nature of the brain and how it's affected by psychological trauma. So there was research there. I also looked into, so Reg has a foreign accent, and I wanted to know how easy it was or hard it would be to recognize where that accent was from just by listening to his voice, how much you can identify an accent from just listening to the kind of the rises and falls of someone's voice. So it was really, I'd come across something and I think, wow, I need to talk to an expert, or I need to talk to a friend, or I need to read a novel that has tackled the issue of memory, or I need to read a memoir about that. And I read a few memoirs about people who'd experienced physical trauma or psychological trauma and had therefore lost their memory, and what a debilitating thing that is to try and navigate the world when you can't remember anything about yourself. Really interesting books that I read on that. So different strands of research.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I share your theory on researching and writing. I kind of also have to do them at the same time, because the thing is, I don't understand how people could research first, because you would research the time. Like, it's like, oh, I'm going to write a book that's related to the Holocaust. Well, you're reading for the rest of your life, and you will never write your book, because like there's too much information. Yeah. So I feel like until you're writing the book, you don't actually know which bits of research you're going to need. Yeah. Which brings me to, well, actually, I'm curious while we're talking about structure, like, so do you know your story? Did you know your whole story and how it would unfold before you started writing? Are you someone who structures things ahead, or did it unfold as you wrote it?
So a bit like the research, I know, I do some research, but then I also, so when, this is something maybe people don't know, might be interested to know who are writers who are hoping to be published, is, your first book, you can kind of write it in any old way that you like, and then you have the finished project and you try and present it to an agent and then publish it. But then subsequent books, I don't know if it's the same for you, Jennifer, you kind of need to sell your publisher on it before you've written it. So I needed to write really quite thorough, chapter outlines, synopsis, character descriptions, just to get it through the publishing process of saying, yes, we're going to support this book and we're happy for this to be your next book. So I had to quite artificially, in a way, generate all that material. And it was helpful because it gave me a structure, but I don't think I stuck to it exclusively. For me, what's very, very important is I have an almost filmic sense of the opening of my books. And that's been the case for every single book that I've had, that there's something that triggers my interest. And then an opening scene unfolds. And to me, within that opening is everything almost that the book needs to hold. And I would actually, in a second, I would love you to read, because you were going to read the opening of your book, and I think it has that similar feel. And so I had this very filmic scene of you know, this man sitting in the rain on a park bench, this little girl and her mother finding her, and how that just kicks everything off. I also often have a sense of, you know, the ending, a rough sense of the ending of where I want to be. And then what I do is I will plan a scene by hand and then write it up on the computer. And so I do lots of kind of mind maps. I've got notebooks, and people always think that I must be very organized to do this, and I'm not. It's just a way that I
do
learn.
think that.
These are kind of my crazy notebook mind maps. So I don't write longhand. I don't write the scene out in longhand. I know some people do. I will write details about what's going to be in the scene, so that I have a picture in my head, and then I'll put that to one side and I'll write the scene. So I kind of plan as I go in that sense. I have an opening scene, an ending scene. I have the notes that I've had to write for my publisher, and then that's sort of how I structure it. How about you?
Yeah, I'm not that organized. I mean, I don't know. I feel when I sit down to write, I feel like if I know where things are going, I have no interest in writing it. So for me, like the discovery process is in the writing for me. And kind of once, I also am someone who writes, you know, 97 drafts of every single book. So, I mean, once I do the first draft and I know where it ends, then the purpose of the first draft is to like figure out the story for me. And then each successive draft, I'm making it all lead up to there.
Yes.
You know, in a way,
and I'm sure, like the reference I made to the ink stained fingers, I'm sure I put that in later when I understood that, you know, art was going to be his vehicle, and so then it comes back, and and I was going to, I guess I'd love to hear the opening of your book in that sense, but also to ask you, because you have some you have something I don't do very often in my books, which is that you get rid of characters. I'm not going to have any spoilers, but you do get rid of characters, and I'm very cross at you for some of those, because it was very upsetting. But also from a craft point of view, I completely understood why you did it. Is that something you have a sense of when you introduce a character, that you know that they might not last the distance? There's just a moment where you know.
Yeah, I mean, the characters who get killed off in various ways. It is a World War II book, so people have to suffer. But yeah, I mean, when I introduced them, no, I didn't know what was going to happen to them. A lot of it was kind of thinking through, you know, okay, given that they end up in this place, what would have likely happened to them? And then, you know, I also, because, well, I don't want to give anything away, but you know, there's interesting different parts of Bolivia people ended up in, because some people got agricultural visas and had to go to the jungle to start these plantations, but most of the people who were sent there were urban professionals who had no agricultural experience, and they didn't have any natural immunities to the diseases. And you know, and I wanted to, I mean, most of them did die in real life. So I mean, my book was inspired by these real refugees, you know.
And isn't that to me, that was what was so heartbreaking, was that these people had just moved across the world to preserve their lives, and then because of the circumstances nevertheless died. I mean, that's very hard to stomach. Because you feel like if there's any justice in the world, you know, after all that, they should have the chance of another life, right? But that's not, you know, that's not the reality.
I mean,
like these refugees who go on a boat and risk everything, and then,
yeah, I mean, fleeing one dangerous place doesn't mean that, you know, the next place will be safe. And is there such a thing as a safe country?
Yeah.
By the way, I just wanted to say to those of you listening that if you have questions for Virginia, please do either put them in the chat, or, you know, raise your hand, tell Elizabeth. Elizabeth, do you want people putting it in the chat or the Q&A, or?
Chat is usually most convenient, so I don't have to remember. Jennifer, did you want to read a passage from your book before we leap into Q&A though?
Sure. I just as a personal anecdote, I read the opening and I stopped and I went to get my husband Hugh and I said, let me read this to you, because I think openings of books are particularly important to me, and this was just, you'll see, you'll be blown away. It's just gorgeous.
Well, I hope it lives up to that. This is my book is structured like Mahler's Third Symphony. It's in movements, and this is the Overture. Since it's a musical book, it has a musical structure. So, Overture. When I think of Austria, I remember what a child remembers, details as vivid as the bright shards of a dream. The coffee-warmed air of the kitchen, the rough fabric of my father's suits against my cheek, the chalk dust of my classroom tickling my nose. Oh, I'm going to mispronounce the German, Virginia. I'm
That's
really
fine.
The ice-crusted snow in the Jesuitenwiese meadow. They cut my eyebrow open when I fell off the toboggan halfway down the slope. My Annalisa. My parents' voices in the kitchen as I hovered still and silent by the door, secretly listening. It was important then to listen. I remember the tang of my mother's apricot jam spread over a thick layer of butter on crusty bread, the fungal stink of my older brother's dirty sports clothing on the bathroom floor, the earthy scent of the square olive oil soap that was always slipping into the sink. I remember a plum tree in our small communal courtyard that dropped its sour sweet fruit onto our terrace. They were a dark dusty purple, more oval than the green ones we would eat in Bolivia. In Vienna, Annalisa's mother collected the dropped fruits and used them to make torts. I remember my mother's voice in our parlor, starting off low and gathering the energy to soar. I remember the scent of rosin on horsehair, the vibrations of my father's viola, how I could feel the notes on my skin even after he stopped playing and I was in bed, listening only to the silence. I remember the inky smell of my school books as I cracked their spines, the sound of Frau Fessler's ruler smashing into my desk when she caught me with a book on my lap during math class. The way the fruit gummies from Vices get stuck in my back teeth, so I had to pick them out with my fingernails. I remember the damp heat of Annalisa's hand as she folded it with mine for the last time. I remember our neighbors' long coats decorated with flocks of badges saying only "Ja." The swastikas on every armband and flag pinned to every lapel, painted on our sidewalks. They even fell from the sky, flurries of paper spiders dropping onto our heads. I remember the newspapers my parents hid from me under sofa cushions. I remember lying awake, twisting the satiny border of my blanket in my fingers until my mother came and curled around me. I remember her breath on my neck, the ice of her fingers on my spine, stroking my skin until I drifted into dreams. The bland quotidian details, the textures of ordinary days, seared themselves most permanently, except for Annalisa. Annalisa, who is neither bland nor ordinary. Annalisa, who is more part of me than not. Our mothers had birthed us in the same building a week apart, and from then on, there were no divisions between us. The 4 syllables of her name were my first song.
I had a best friend growing up in France called Annelise. So
did you?
Annelise in France. Isn't that crazy? Since I was 3 years old.
That's do you know what's funny is, first of all, I changed the syllables. Like I had 3 syllables of her name, and then one of my proofreaders called and said, actually, if you pronounce it in the German way, it has 4 syllables. And I was like, oh no.
I've never heard it said in German. I've only ever heard the French Annelise.
Yeah, well, I think I was thinking of it that way. I think I was thinking of it as Annalise, and then they said no, it'd be Annalisa, and I was like, okay, so I'm changing it to 4. So I changed it to 4 when I read it out loud because I'm now pronouncing it Annalisa. But my daughter's always like, when she read the overture, she basically said, I want a friend just like Annalisa. That's who I want. And I'm like, but sweetheart, she's not real. I made her up.
You know, I think it is so powerful, and I think that's what you capture in your book, the power of a first friendship. And I think for a girl in particular, when I used to run a girls' dorm, I used to run a girls' dorm of like 75 girls in England, and the biggest issues were always friendship issues. And I said to mothers, you know, your first female friend when you're a little girl is as important as your first love, you know. And with you, obviously, the boundaries are become, you know, more complicated in that sense, but it runs so deep. And I see that with my 6-year-old girl, you know, the relationships she forms with her friends, they go so deep. And that notion of, you know, romantic love or friendship love, and but I think that all of you who listen to that particularly, I mean, you know, it doesn't compare our experience, you know, with COVID, but that sense of, you know, how life was, and then how everything can just shift. You know, that this happy little girl with her best friend living in the same building, and her artistic musical parents, and a life that was just full of no more than children's worries, and how just in a second it can just change. And I feel we'll feel that. I felt that the other day actually walking through Gibson's, the bookstore that Elizabeth kind of you know, works in, and then, you know, is the events coordinator for, and Michael Herman is the owner, and he's, you know, he's on here too. And I felt really emotional just walking through it, because it felt like this is what life used to be like. And I haven't been persecuted, and I haven't been sick, and haven't experienced, you know, I'm an immigrant, but I haven't experienced anything like what others have. But the sense of a life being lost, I mean, you've experienced that many times, haven't you, Jennifer? Because you have, you know, you've lived around the world in very extreme circumstances. And
yes, although I have the privilege of making the choice, so I've chosen where we go. I mean, in a way, you know, I mean, it's been hardest on my daughter. It's easy when kids are young; they adapt super easily. But now that she's 10 and has intense friendships, like, and you know, when we drive her away from that, it's tough. So we're at a difficult age. But I happen to notice that someone has written in a question. Elizabeth, did you want to ask the question, or?
Yes, and I have a couple of my own too. Carla
Okay.
wants to ask each of you, do you ever imagine who might play the characters in your books if they're made into a movie? Virginia, do you want to take that first?
Not as I'm writing, not automatically. I think I often ask Hugh, because he's a real film buff in the way that I'm not as well filmically versed as he is. But interestingly, Milo, my first novel, my debut, has been optioned for a film, which is both very, very exciting, but also could lead to absolutely nothing because of the way the film industry works. But I always thought, when I pictured Milo, that he'd be like a little, you know, little Jake Gyllenhaal, just something about that kind of, that very innocent, cute little face, but in a small boy, you know. So I imagine what he would be like as a little boy in that particular role. So I think I sometimes do, or when people ask me, but it's not an automatic thing. I think some people cast their books and have a very clear sense of who will be who. How about you? I think you had your film, wasn't Anne Hathaway meant to play in The Ambassador's Wife? Is that right?
She was. So yeah, that book was optioned to be a television miniseries, but that option, as often happens, has expired. So if anyone's interested, rights are available. Yeah, it was interesting because there were 4 actresses who tried to option that book, and it was interesting for me to think about the 4 of them, and actually none of them were how I imagined my character. I mean, I was thrilled for them to be, but I was like, that's not how I pictured her. But I'd be you know, overjoyed for any of them to do it. But it is, I never really, I mean, this is weird, but I have not actually seen a movie in more than a year. I just don't have time. I wish I did. I'm desperate to see a movie, but it's been so long, and I don't know the names of actors. I remember thinking that Idris Elba would make a great ambassador in The Ambassador's Wife. But in Exile music, they would have to be someone who were German speaking, and I don't know a lot of German speaking actors who would also speak Spanish. I don't know. It would be a difficult movie to cast, I guess. Tricky question.
Well, you sound like you're almost spoiled for choice with the actresses.
Yeah.
I want to know, so Jennifer, do you play an instrument? Virginia, do you draw?
Both of you actually, as mothers, might identify with this. That being a mother forces you into doing things that you haven't done for years. So, you know, the amount I sing with my children when, you know, my voice is okay, but really not great, and the amount I draw, just because my 6-year-old's like, draw a hedgehog. And I'm like, oh, really?
Yeah.
How? So I think as a mother, I've ended up drawing a lot more than, you know, before I had my children, and thinking a lot more about drawing. But I remember once, you know, hearing someone say, you know, beware of writers who write about writers. And I think what they meant was, you know, that part of our job as writers is to inhabit the lives of people who are different from us. And so what I find really interesting is sometimes giving my characters skills or talents that are quite different from me, so that I can get to know that world, because I find that really interesting, getting to know worlds that are different from me. So in one of my young adult books, I have a little girl who is a brilliant swimmer, and she swims butterfly stroke, and I found out so much about that and how you use your body, and I found that so interesting, because I like fresh air and walking, but I'm not an athlete at all. I'm not athletic, and that mindset fascinated me. And so I wanted to know what it was like to, no, I'm not good at drawing, but I love artists and I love art, and I loved finding out about how the process of art works. How about you, Jennifer? Are you musical?
I am not. I very kind of selfishly always give my characters jobs that I wish I had and skills that I wish I had, because that way I get to virtually live through them. So, you know, in The Bastard's Wife, my main character was a painter, and I'm not artistic either, other than I do draw cats and bunnies for my daughter on demand. But I don't, I mean, I took, you know, I basically took a few years of piano lessons, a few years of violin, was not good at either, or rather refused to practice. Kids, practice your instruments, or you will end up like me. But I just, no, I'm not musical. And I guess when I started meeting survivors in Bolivia, like my main contact was a violin player who was also a conductor. And then I started researching the Vienna Philharmonic, which has the most horrific history as an orchestra. You know, they sent all their Jewish musicians to their deaths.
I was really surprised about that, Jennifer, because I just thought the bond that you form when you're playing in an orchestra, I always associated it with being like a team, you know, that somehow you would have each other's backs. And maybe it's because maybe fear has such an important role to play, that your own preservation is so much, you know, you will trump everything. But I was really surprised at how quickly people turned their backs on the Jews in Vienna. Really surprised.
Yeah, you know, they have Vienna. It was horrific. I mean, it was really interesting to me because, you know, I was in theater for so much of my life, and as an actor, like the kind of, you know, you do watch each other's backs. Like you know, other actors helped me pay my rent when I couldn't. I mean, like it really was a community. And like in an orchestra, I just imagine what it must be like to be playing an instrument next to someone you know wants you dead. I mean, what is that like? And you know, the Vienna Philharmonic continued to employ Nazis until 1967.
Wow. Like
straight through the war and after the war. And this was something I didn't know before researching this book. And everyone I've said that to has been like, really? I didn't know. But I mean, and they didn't even employ women until recently, because they were like, oh, well, women can't create the same sound, you know. Yeah. But now that they have blind auditions, you know, like if they have blind auditions where they can't see who's playing the music, they're far more likely to pick people of color and women. Because of course we all can play instruments just as well as white men, strangely. Anyway, we got a bit off topic, Elizabeth, sorry.
No, it's really fascinating.
I love this. This is fascinating. Let's wrap up the event with some rapid fire questions here that I will alternate between the two of you. Virginia, when you snack, do you like salty or sweet?
Sweet.
Sweet. Jennifer, is coffee or tea better?
Coffee, but I like both.
Okay. Virginia, can you teach the American audience here, as a British woman, the best way to prepare a cup of tea?
Okay, so teapot first. You need to preheat the teapot. So you boil water, you preheat the teapot. Then ideally you have tea leaves. If you don't have tea leaves, you can put the tea bag in the teapot that is very hot, and so it opens up the leaves and starts steaming. Then you put boiling, you need to, ideally, you know, the water needs to be at boiling point. So then you put the boiling water into the teapot. Then you put the milk at the bottom of the teacup. And then once the teapot has brewed its tea to the requisite brew, you then pour the tea over the milk into the teacup. That is my way. There are many other ways to do it, but ideally that is your cup of tea. There's nothing worse, and this is an interesting point about Jennifer's book, which distressed me greatly when reading it, that you live in Bolivia, you cannot make yourself a decent cup of tea or coffee because at altitude water does not boil, or has a different boiling point.
Or boil, yeah, different temperature.
Different temperature, and so everything is kind of lukewarm. Can you imagine having to drink tea and coffee lukewarm? I mean, it doesn't open up the tea leaves. It doesn't, you know, release the aroma of the coffee. So anyway, sorry, that was a long answer.
Jennifer, which of your characters would you most like to meet?
Which of my characters? I guess
in the book,
or I guess Orly. The girl in my, well, she's a woman when the book ends. I guess Orly from Exile music.
Last question, Virginia. Last book you bought for the cover?
Oh, I kind of guessed you might ask me that. This one. I'm coming prepared.
Oh, I have that. I have that too.
I just, this is again a little bit of publishing info. So my imprint is quite commercial at Little Brown, and so they always like photographic covers because they think that they're more generally appealing and look better on a variety of shelves, including supermarket shelves. Of course, selling books in supermarkets is not where you should, anyway. So the books that I really love are ones like this that have ambiguity and color, and this is The Vanishing Half, which is about I gather twins and Black twins who go and live very different lifestyles and how that affects them and their psychology. And I just love that sense of these two people who are so alike and then become different. And to me, I see a cover like that in Gibson's and I'm like, right, I'm buying that. It's so important, isn't it? To me anyway.
Yeah, I just heard her speak as part of the
Did you? Was she great?
Yeah. She was really great. And and one of the twins passes as white, which is kind of important for this.
Oh gosh, so
yeah, but yes, it sounds like I haven't read it yet, but I do have it downstairs in my study. Yeah. So yeah, I'm excited. I'm looking forward to reading it because she was.
How about you, Jennifer? What's the last book that do you remember a cover that you liked?
I wish I were in my office because it's just we don't get internet down there. So.
Oh, sorry. How about you, Elizabeth? Did you?
Last book I got for my cover is, I can't remember the name. Oh, I might have it here. I don't, but the new Naomi Novak book, which is like black and gold and like circles, and I don't know what's going on here, but it's absolutely beautiful. And I read it yet? No, but did I buy it immediately? Yes, I did. So yeah. I don't know what it's about at all. But I think there's a magical school, and I think, I know kind of what it's about. There's a magical school, and the protagonist of the novel is like the most hated person in school, and her rival is the chosen one, and she's just like, I'm gonna plot his death. And you're like, what? Oh, so I don't know if it's gonna be good or not, but the cover's
I feel like publishers are actually going the extra mile with books these days. I mean, the decent publishers, because for a long time we thought everything was going to go digital and so covers wouldn't matter anymore. And I feel like now we have almost a stronger bond to the physical object because it feels so special in a way. To me, I feel like my relationship to the physical objects of books has just increased over time. And to me, Jennifer's is just is just gorgeous. The font and the colors and these three characters at the front. And the sad thing is, this will be for another conversation. I'm currently in a minor battle with my with my editors at Little Brown because they've sent me covers, and I'm not someone who's very outspoken. I tend to go with what people tell me because I'm thinking, you're the expert for marketing and so on. But it's very, very thrillery. So this is my book, which comes out in April and is about gun control in New Hampshire, and it's very thrillery, and it's not a thriller. But they know that a thriller type cover is going to sell copies. I want something beautiful and artistic, but hey,
right.
It's hard. Did you get some say, Jennifer? Did you get some say in your cover?
Well, I don't know, say. I mean, not generally. I mean, this is probably the best cover I've had, but I've had words over all my covers, like actual. Like just there's, somewhere I used language that my agent then had to translate and communicate to my publisher in a better, more productive way than I would have because I was so kind of upset about it. But I mean, with my first book, they just wanted this, which is about running a newspaper in Yemen. They had this pink cover with a fruit on it, and I thought, this is about running a newspaper in Yemen, and you're just going to give me a pink cover with a fruit? Is it because I'm a girl? Like, I was outraged. And I was like, this takes place in Sanaa. No one can imagine what Sanaa looks like. It's the most beautiful city I've ever seen.
Interestingly, my agent got quite crossed by the very thrillery cover that they've come up with. And she said, if a man had written that book, they would have come up with that cover. They would have come up with something much more upmarket. It's because a woman's written that book, and it's kind of, a woman writes a thriller type book. It fits within a category and a genre that fits on a bookshelf, which will sell. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting to me.
Yeah. I mean, The Ambassador's Wife, if that book had been written by a man, first of all, it would have been shelved differently, like in novels about the Middle East, rather than like women's fiction, which it's not. It's just a novel about the Middle East and a kidnapping. It's not domestic, but anyway. But they at first they gave me this very kind of romancy cover, and I'm like, this is not a romance. That's not the kind of book this is. And if a man had written it, it would have gotten a completely different. They would have put guns on the cover. Not that I wanted guns on the cover, but would have been more appropriate.
Fascinating, the gender violence. Yeah. Sorry, a little rant on our political.
We could go on and on.
the after event. I think we need to end it here. Thank you everybody joining us. Virginia, Jennifer, thank you for joining us. Next time we speak, we shall have to have a review of The Vanishing Half from each of you, and we will have our own little book club where we discuss how it turned out for you. Thank you to everybody joining us this evening. Both Virginia and Jennifer's books are available from Gibson's Bookstore. Virginia's are signed. Jennifer's do come with signed book plates. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Jennifer. Sleep well.
Thank you so much.